So we're joined today by filmmaker Eros V, director of the BIFA nominated short film Meat Puppet. Just if you haven't seen it, it's available online, and it's the crazy tale of a toy obsessed young man who finds his soul trapped in a puppet. Welcome to Director's Notes, Eros.
Thank you for having me, Rob.
Like I said, today we're going to be talking about Meat Puppet. But before we launch into talking about your short, I wanted to give our viewers who may not have seen your work before a bit of a quick introduction to what you do. It's quite weird, actually. I can remember the first time I came across your work quite clearly. It was watching Random Acts, and I saw your brilliant short, Right Place, Wrong Tim on there.
Right, yeah.
And without getting too sloppy with you, it was kind of love at first sight. I knew I knew from that point that you were going to be a filmmaker that I really liked, and honestly, you haven't let me down yet. You've obviously
Thank
gone on
God
to
for
make
that. Thank God for that, yeah.
you've gone on to make a few other shorts after that one with a Double Tap, Good Boy, and of course Meat Puppet, which we're talking about today. What I really love about your short film work is that they're this mix of kind of genre filmmaking and comedy. But it seems to me like what's most important is just the entertainment value. I'm always like massively entertained when I watch your film. Um, if you're kind of introducing your filmmaking to someone who hasn't seen your work before, how do you introduce it? And what kind of inspired you to take this route in filmmaking?
That is a fantastic question. I mean, the way I try to the sort of if the to the extent that there can be a philosophy when you're making short films and learning, right, which is really part of it, and learning what your style is going to be and the sort of stories you want to tell. I kind of tend to go for just like basically balls to the wall, kind of all killer, no filler, thrill ride, entertainment. With a very bizarre twist, like something that sort of gets me excited. But I mean, I think I've always really loved. I grew up watching crazy genre movies, and I grew up very much just watching like whatever I could get my hands on a DVD from like Sainsbury's or wherever. So it meant a lot of like these sort of big high concept Hollywood blockbusters, basically. And when my family aren't in film, there wasn't much understanding of how film really worked. So, for me, in a weird way, it was always like beginner's mind. I didn't go to film school. I used to act, so that was my kind of way into the industry. So I had a sense of how sets work. But in terms of like the ideas I came to, I always came back to something sort of bombastic and basically way too big for the budgets that I actually get in reality. And so it's always been this kind of thing of being like, okay, when I sit down to think of an idea, it's always something big and crazy. And then, usually the challenge is to try and distill it in a way. But I think it's effectively like I love films. I love films that are really fun. I think for me, like every film should have some kind of story, some kind of narrative, some kind of purpose, basically. And ideally be as kind of crazy and out there as possible. So it's those kind of confluence things basically that I hope I'm trying to work on basically through these sort of shorts. And I think with Meat Puppet, it sort of feels like it's getting there a little bit. I like to think.
Yeah, definitely. I think crazy and unpredictable is a good way to describe your
That's
filmmaking.
what I should have said. That I give you like a single answer when really all we needed to go for was crazy, unpredictable, and
Unpredictable.
hopefully fulfilling in some way.
So, of course, talking of crazy and unpredictable, Meat Puppets, pretty out there. Um, Again,
Mm.
for anyone who hasn't seen the film, get online and watch it. Um, but it's basically this story of this young man who's kind of needs to grow up, um, and he's got this very important day ahead of him, and he should be getting ready to go and meet his girlfriend, but instead, this puppet gets delivered in the post, and of course, he decides, I'm going to put this puppet on, um, and mess around with it because, of course, he's not quite grown up yet. Um, so again, it's a pretty wild idea. Where did the inspiration for your story come from?
Yeah, so it's a pretty it's an equally bizarre story, which is the short I made, a couple of shorts previous to this, I made this short called Double Tap, a horror movie about Instagram. And for reasons that I'll never understand, someone at the Henson Company who make the Muppets watched it, and reached out, came to me and sort of said, basically, would you make something weird but involving puppets? And I was like, okay, all right, that's pretty intriguing. So I kind of went away and I thought about it, and I came up with this sort of idea, and I went back to them. So I said, how about this? And they were like, no, no, don't, not interested. Um, too weird. But I was basically left with this sort of script and this concept. And really what it started with is kind of basically what every idea starts with me, which is some kind of funny image. And the funny image was basically this tiny puppet that's, become possessed and sentient, that's still attached to this sort of dying body, basically. And then it's trying to get itself out while it's attached to the body. And that was the beginning point. And then it became a question, really, it could have just been a very funny short, and it is. But I think then it became a question like, okay, what's the story in that? Why would this happen to a person? And then pretty quickly it sort of became this thing of being like, well, it's probably going to happen to a sort of immature, this sort of person who basically is adamantly refusing to be a grown-up and needs to be effectively trapped into a tiny childlike sort of toy so that he can learn the value of being a grown-up and everything that he had that he threw away. So that became the narrative. And once that kind of crystallized, then I think it let me effectively kind of get away with / persuade people to do all of the crazy shit that happens on top of it in the film. But yeah, that was sort of the genesis, and it's funny, yeah. So it sort of started as a kind of what if, and it sort of spiraled into being like what it's become.
No, that's wild. Yeah, I never realized the Henson Company reached out. That's amazing. Um,
Yeah, I guess it was. I mean, it was worth a. It's so funny because I guess these things you do think, why would you bother thinking about like puppets in that sort of way, but like amazing stuff can come of it, I guess.
yeah, yeah. And what about the title? What about the title of the film? It always kind of makes me giggle when I think about it. I'm a I'm a 46-year-old man, but I read the word meat puppet and yeah, start giggling. What made you go for the name?
I mean, I love, again, like I think because of the stuff that I grew up watching, right? Like I always try and think of this 1-2 punch of like the title of the film and the premise of the film, and they should work in harmony. I think about like Bruce Almighty and the idea as a random guy being given the power of God. Like how amazing that title is, and how it sort of perfectly captures the idea of the script. And with this one, it was obviously quite hard. It was like, how do you figure out a title for a film that's basically about a guy who's trapped in a puppet and has to like move around this sort of dead body? And weirdly, this is super bizarrely unrelated to it, but back when I was acting, I used to, did this TV show with a director called David S. Goyer, who did like a lot of the Blade movies and Man of Steel and stuff. And he basically used to call affectionately all of the actors his meat puppets. And so I just always had that phrase in my head, I think. And when I was like thinking of a way, just anything to call it, it just kind of popped out. And then I was like, well, that's perfect because it's basically this puppet that has to like move around this dying body in this sort of flip of what you'd expect. So that was where it came from. And yeah, I just at one point we talked about changing it because I was sort of like, I don't know, it's kind of funny, but we could experiment with it. And then it just was like everybody was basically like, no, I mean it's perfect. We shouldn't touch it. So it just stuck basically.
It is perfect, I think. I think that's not just a good analogy for actors, almost a good analogy for humans, as it is.
Yeah,
We're all just basically meat puppets.
exactly. And particularly, I think that character in particular, he's so, again, like this idea of somebody who doesn't want to grow up I think that's the sort of vibe, right? You're this sort of, you're an adult now, but your adult form is like a burden. Oh, I just wish I was like an energetic kid again. And so yeah, it's just got loads of meanings basically. And I think once if you've got a title that does that, that's usually, I think, a winning formula almost always.
Yeah, yeah. You're kind of part way there already before you
Mm.
even start making the film.
Or at least it
Um,
lets you know. I guess we're getting really off
all right,
track
no,
here,
no,
but
go for it.
it's just that what's great about it is it lets you know that you know what your film is. So like when you're making a film, right, the biggest challenge is actually knowing what the hell you're making. It's really easy to look at the end result and be like, these guys knew what they were doing all along. But that actually that's never a given. And having a title that you're like, that tells me what it is. It means that whenever you're having ideas about how you're going to shoot it, how you're going to write it, you can almost check back in and be like, does that actually work? Does that meet the premise itself? So I think that's also why I find them very useful. Anyway,
No, that's good.
digress.
That's good. I think yeah, it's definitely a title that sets expectations. You're not going into it and expecting a serious drama, that's for sure. And you mentioned Bruce Almighty there, and I know that your film was somewhat inspired by these morality tales.
Mm.
Um, so I mean, when we think about that, and underneath this kind of crazy concept of this possessed puppet, there's actually quite a grounded story of this young man who really needs to grow up. So what made you want to tackle these particular themes in Meat Puppet?
Yeah, I think it's like, I mean, I'm I'm a nerd. I'm a pretty nerdy sort of person, and I will, unashamedly spend my Saturday morning watching like Tokyo Ghoul or some random anime thing, which is someone who's about to turn 30 is, not necessarily what one expects from life. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but I think that there is this thing which I've felt in my life, where you do get to a point where you've got to balance these things, and you can't be totally, necessarily like sat on your sofa playing PlayStation and watching anime all day. You have to balance it. It's not to say you have to throw it out the window, but you have to find a sort of balance. So I think it was kind of like that as a general idea about what it means to grow up. And then, as I said, like really the way it works for me is often it starts with the image, right? So it starts with the idea itself, and then you kind of work backwards. And sometimes I find out, I guess, like what I was thinking after the fact. You're like, okay, I've started with this idea of the puppet dragging around the body. Why am I interested in that? What's fun? What's the fun of that? And then you kind of work backwards and go, okay, I think it's actually about this thing. Basically, when I was a kid, I had like, what felt like 4 DVDs, and they were like, Liar Liar, Bruce Almighty, and Big, and like basically anything Jim Carrey related, or that sort of time. And like all of those films, they're crazy ideas, right? They're absolutely batshit, bizarre, high concept ideas, but they always hang on something very fundamental and like relatable to anyone and everyone. Like Liar Liar is such a great example. This idea of like when you're an adult, you have to lie, and sort of navigating that, how much people do lie, and how necessary it is. And like you take a crazy batshit idea and then you make it feel relatable to people. And I think that's just something that I've always wanted to try and do, because it's in some ways the easiest bit is having the crazy idea. The hard bit is making the crazy idea resonate or feel relatable, so that when people watch it, they're like, I understand now why this idea has purpose. So yeah, I mean, I think this case, it was just like a personal observation about what it means to sort of grow up. And I think for a lot of us sort of nerdier people, the idea of being like, well, we don't necessarily want to get rid of like, the extensive collection of, Mario figurines that we have, but it's like, it's okay to slim down to 2 or 3 to make way for other stuff. It was that kind of like balance that I also just thought was quite funny. And I guess I hope that like it worked, other people see it and kind of vibe with it a little bit.
Yeah, well, I think it's definitely relatable in that aspect. I know personally, it's something I can relate with. I mean, just out of shot here, I've got like my kid robot collectibles, so just angled the camera so we couldn't see those. But I know from from watching the film myself, there's that kind of there's that really relatable moment where he's like, okay, I know I need to leave the house and do something important, but I could just stay here and have a little bit more fun, couldn't I? And
Yeah,
that's so relatable.
yeah. I
Um,
just think those moments, yeah, they're so I don't know. I just think about the amount of times I've done it. And I think if you start with when you're writing, if you're like, I've done this thing, that's usually a good place for a character.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, so let's talk puppets for a minute. Obviously, the puppet's kind of one of the stars of the film. Um,
Mm.
and obviously you mentioned the Henson Company earlier. And looking at the puppet, that's kind of the vibe I get from it. It's kind of almost like it's got this more family friendly feel. But obviously, when you think of genre filmmaking and you think of horror films that have puppets in, that's not really the look you're expecting. You're expecting like something out of Puppet Master or Child's Play, something much more sinister and creepy.
Yeah.
So what made you kind of go for this design or this look with a puppet?
It's a very good question. I mean, a confluence of things. The general thing, right, again, is like form fits function, right? So this is ultimately a story about a person that needs to grow up. And so, early on, our amazing puppet designer, who also was the lead puppeteer, Hugh Purvis, was like, do we want to give it human eyes? We want to do, had so many amazing ideas because he's such a talented guy. And I think what it came down to in the end for us both was being like, this puppet needs to feel childlike. It needs to feel like a the physical embodiment of his inner child. So actually, like anything that took it into being more humanoid or more, because basically that's often what creepy puppets are. Creepy puppets to me are the ones that like they're like eerie, like Annabelle or something, where like they're cute, but then they have like very vivid eyes or just some kind of haunting uncanniness to them where they feel like they're on the cusp of life. And actually, with this, what we almost went the other way. We were like, no, 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 it actually needs to feel distinctly kiddie and sweet and cute and sort of dumb because what it's trying to do is so its sort of adventure is so like life or death or serious or it's attempting to be a grown up. The entire film is this guy basically trying to sort the situation out. And so what really makes that funnier and what makes it thematically, relevant is that the puppet itself is kiddie and childish. And I think, part of that is also preference. Like I just like that sort of look. I really like things that are kind of cute slash scary. And I think like that puppet, the style of it, feeling like almost Muppet-esque was very important. And then the other thing is like, we had so many discussions about how humanoid adjacent to make it. Because what's really interesting with puppets is that like the expression you get out of them and the versatility of that is related to what little features you give them. So the biggest reference that we used was actually like the modern Muppets movie, the first one with Jason Segel and Amy Adams, where they've got the main puppet in that, Walter, who's like orange and feels very humanoid. Like he's supposed to feel basically like a human. In contrast to actually to like Kermit, who is much more puppet-esque. Um, and so that was why we ended up with going for things like giving the puppet ears and various things like that. And then the two innovations, what Hugh brought in these sort of the eyes, which are like joined together with this sort of eyebrow, and that's one of his sort of trademark things that he likes to do, and that is so effective on screen because it's so vivid. So no matter where you put the puppet, even in a really wide shot, its eyes you can really tell where it's looking, and it feels very alive. And then the other thing was I just wanted it to have a mullet because I just thought it'd be funny. So yeah, I mean, it's a mixture of very deep thinking and just dumb shit of me being like, let's give it a mullet, and he was like, fine.
That's always the perfect mix, isn't it?
Yeah.
Some deep thinking and some crazy shit. That's what you need basically. And I think yeah, definitely the choices definitely work. Again, could have gone for something instantly creepier, but in a way, the fact that you haven't gone down that route makes it creepy as hell anyway, because it looks kind of almost yeah cute and welcoming, but you know covered in pentagrams and blood.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah. So I'm also interested in how you brought the puppet to life. I mean, there are some scenes you watch and you think, okay, that's just puppetry. I get that. But then there's other scenes where you kind of look at it and you think, okay, how's he done that? Some great scenes, like for example, when the puppet is dragging Oz across the floor. So yeah,
Yeah.
can you talk a little bit about like your production? How much of it is practical effects? How much did you use any VFX in there?
I mean, I'm pretty open about, this is the sort of thing where if this were a Hollywood movie, everybody would be trying to say that it's all practical effects and it's all in camera and there's no VFX, in the sense that everything is in camera, and everything is real and everything is done for real. But obviously there is visual effects because we've got puppeteers and rods and various things that we need to make those things happen. So I like to sort of be open about the fact that we do use visual effects because I love them. And I think if you use them in the right way, they're an amazing tool to augment what you can do on set. So bringing the puppet to life and basically achieving the film was like, that's probably the biggest technical challenge. So there's like 100 visual effects shots in there. Most of them are painting out of rods or puppeteers, but like it's an enormous amount. There's feature films that have much less visual effects in them than this sort of 10-minute short. And for me, usually how I like to think about it is it's like you're kind of performing a magic trick, right? And like there's certain shots where, as you say, people kind of know how it's happening, but they go along with it. Like the puppet is talking, and they kind of know that there's a guy out of shot, but they go along with it, they buy it. But then you have these moments where suddenly people are watching it and they're like, well, hang on a second, how the hell did that happen? And I think that's what really, those are the moments that kind of embed you basically in the narrative, because past a point you stop looking for how it's being done. Once the illusion is great enough, you forget all about how it's being done and you just focus on the story. And I think we talked about it like this early on, which was like, the whole goal of the production was to get to this point of like we had to do so much stuff behind the scenes, a lot of prep, a lot of visual effects, and it was all for this moment. You like pull the curtain away and the puppet would be alive, and then at that moment you're just left with the story. And that's why the story is so important, because you can achieve this thing. So how we did it was we had two puppeteers, for the most part, in like morph suits basically, and they're in a lot of shots, doing the puppet, and we shot loads of plates, painted them out. It was all done in a way that was incredibly lo-fi, actually, so that we could achieve it. Because obviously we had very, like, basically no money, so it all had to be incredibly simple. And really, the answer to how we did it was just like we thought about it a lot and about how we wanted it to feel. So there's the moment, say, when they're having the argument, and like I really wanted that to feel like sort of almost like sloppy handheld coverage, because it feels like they're really in the middle of this argument. But what's interesting with that is you can't shoot handheld coverage when you need to paint out two puppeteers. I
Yeah.
mean, you could if you had millions of dollars, but if you don't, you can't really do that. So in order to match it, we shot her stuff handheld, and then we shot the puppet locked off with multiple plates, and then we shot a plate of handheld motion, which we then applied to the shot. So it feels like you're watching this sloppy scene, but in reality, in order to achieve that, you need to do like shoot it 5 different ways and comp those things together. So yeah, I mean, it's all incredibly practical, because the actors are there, they're talking to the puppet, they can touch the puppet, they can do whatever they want. But we used a lot of visual effects to facilitate that, so that these actors can be in the moment, and they can touch and they can interact. and they can do all of this stuff, and we made sure that they could by thinking ahead. So yeah, it was a bit of a challenge, but it's worth it, I think.
Yeah, definitely paid off. And a good link there to my next question, because you talked about your actors and your cast are great in the film. Especially kind of when they're either possessed in the puppet or talking to the puppet. They do a
Yeah.
great job of really kind of making sure you don't kind of become you don't lose the immersion in the film basically because of their performances. So, how did you get your actors involved, and what do you think they bring to the film?
I mean, the film would not work without, Mairéad and David. I mean, they just completely bring it to life. I mean, they're exceptional, the pair of them. They both had incredibly hard jobs to do, in very different ways. I mean, Mairéad on set has such a tough job because she's obviously, David is playing a dead body at that stage. So, she's holding that we basically rehearsed everything with them too, so that we knew what it felt like with, as if it were happening between these two for real. And then when we got on set, Mairéad is basically holding the memory of what those scenes feel like and doing it with the puppeteer instead of David. So it's an incredibly challenging thing to basically kind of hold the memory almost of what the scene is going to feel like with David, and then apply that to, what Hugh's actually doing, and then a different voice and a different personality. So it's incredible. And then David vice versa, as in, he's basically, he's blocking out and rehearsing the scene, and then he's playing a dead body, and then, a few months later he's in a recording studio redubbing the lines. So it was a big challenge, but I mean, yeah, I'm insanely lucky that they both said yes. It was a complete shot in the dark with them both. I really didn't expect us to get such an exceptionally, world class cast, and that's probably the thing I'm most grateful for. But we basically, yeah, we just sort of reached out to them and sent them it, and I guess just were very lucky that they both were game and presumably didn't have anything going on that week. And were just super up for it. But yeah, they do a fantastic job because, as I said, like the whole thing is about this illusion that, like, when you strip away all the technical stuff, you're left with two characters. And they managed to just keep that despite, one of them being in a puppet or the other one talking to a puppet. And that is seriously hard, even if it doesn't necessarily look it.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the things I like about Meat Puppet and all of your filmmaking, to be honest, is the fact that they never really outstay their welcome. You stick to quite tight run times with your films, you know. And with a film like this, maintaining that kind of energy throughout is just not an easy thing. And I think, watching Meat Puppet, yeah, a lot of that comes down to the edit and the cinematography. So can you talk a little bit about how you kind of maintain this sense of urgency throughout the short?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is, firstly, thank you for saying that. I think that is, I have a big thing. I think we all do, right? Even with modern day films, where I'm like, everything is just too long. You've got
Yeah.
these 2.5 hour long films, and they're just like, you're like, everyone is going out of their mind because they don't need to be that long. Ultimately, people's time and film is very precious. Because, we have this thing now where we can shoot on digital, we can shoot as long as we want, we can edit much easier than when it was physical film. So I think we've gotten used to being able to kind of do what we want. But people's time and the medium of film, I think, for me is precious. So if you can tell a story, in a way that's more condensed, you should effectively, you should use what you need, and very little on top of that. And I think it's also just down to, like, yeah, that's my taste. Those are the movies that I love to watch, are ones that have basically narrative urgency. And I think that was the thing, um, particularly with Meat Puppet, but with all of them, is like, you usually get to a point where people, if you're watching something, you see, you get the idea. You're like, oh, okay, with Right Place, Wrong Time, it's like, I get it. There's some clones, and it's very funny. But at a certain point, you're like, okay, I understand it now. Now what? And I think as a writer or maker, you're always trying to think, basically put yourself in the audience's position and be like, what are they going to be thinking? and you get to a point and they are thinking, cool, I understand that bit. Now where's the change? Where's the flip? And in Meat Puppet, you see him dragging around. It's very fun. He's trapped in the puppet, and the answer to the question of what next is his sort of soon to be ex girlfriend arriving. And as you're watching, you're like, okay, here's the next sort of thickener and thickener as with the plot. And in terms of maintaining it, work really closely with my editor Flora. She's unbelievably good. We've worked together now for like 5 years, edited basically everything together. And we work, that's very sort of tireless and collaborative to get to a point where we feel like we have a really tight, sort of formidably tight edit that just keeps things moving. And yeah, I mean, it's basically that. I just think on a fundamental level, that's what I like to watch. I like films that are like, they know their purpose and they know what they're doing. And they also understand that as a viewer, you're also intelligent and you like that bit, but you're ready for the change and you're ready for the plot to advance. So that's what we try to do. And yeah, hopefully getting better at it with time, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's the real skill, isn't it? Telling the story in condensed time, giving the story just the right amount of time it needs. That's where the talent is, and I think you definitely do that in your films.
Thank you.
So Meat Puppet played South by Southwest earlier this year, where it won a couple of awards. Congratulations for those, and is now in the running for the best British short at the BIFAs. With comedy and horror kind of somewhat overlooked usually when it comes to awards, what do these kind of accolades mean to you as a filmmaker?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, when I sat down and wrote the script for Meat Puppet, which at one point features, a puppet going into a grown man's arse, I didn't necessarily picture it as an awards piece in any meaningful way. But I just went out there to have fun, really, and make something that I think I'd watch and that I thought people would like. And I think I'm really grateful, basically. And I think it's also really important, particularly with the biffers, I think, because there isn't that much stuff that comes out of the UK that gets to be weird, and that's partly because there's no money for it. There's very little funding, and this film was rejected by basically everybody before we scraped together the money by hook or by crook. And I think it's really important that films like this and a lot of the other ones that are on that BIFA shortlist and now nominated, that there are these really cutting edge out there movies, because they can come from Britain, and they can not only come from Britain, but they can go to the US and internationally, and they can win awards and they can win these sort of major festivals. And we should be very proud of that we do that. And I think when I look around and see a lot of the shorts that come out of Britain, I'm sure that you do this, I think, yeah, these are really good. And so in that sense, it's really meaningful, like to look at these nominees and the shortlist and see that reflected in it, see these genres that we often overlook in Britain. I think that's the thing that matters most to me. Obviously, it's nice for us personally, but that's what's really cool.
Yeah, I totally agree. So thanks so much for joining us today, Els. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you. I could go on and on, to be honest, talking about Meat Puppet and your work. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks, Rob. I really appreciate it, mate.